Okay, that we mentioned that when Zachary Taylor was elected president, which was really an oddity, because he had absolutely no political experience whatsoever, by the time he took office, there was a lot of controversy that was surrounding the nation. Both Northerners and Southerners are upset over 4 major issues that concern slavery across the country. In the first instance, Southerners were very upset because California had applied for admission into the Union. They would want to come in as a free state, and this was going to disrupt the balance between free and slave states. The second issue that came up upset both Northerners and Southerners, because that issue of slavery, what we were going to do with slavery in the lands we acquired from the Mexican War, was still unsettled. And it made Northerners and Southerners unsettled. Southerners were also upset because the North was supporting a law that would abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. And with California possibly coming in and giving the free states the advantage in Congress, it looked like that would happen. And then Northerners are very upset because they're opposed to the Southern request for a fugitive slave law in the North, which meant that slaves that ran away from the South that ended up in the North could be captured and brought back to their owners. And you know what was going to happen if they got brought back? The treatment was going to be very poor. Now, any of these issues could lead America to the brink of civil war. Now, it eventually will, but we're going to give it one more try to compromise these issues on slavery. And this compromise is going to be called the Compromise of 1850, and the one that's going to step in and make this compromise to try to get North and South back on better terms again will be the famous Henry Clay. Because of this job he does here in the Compromise of 1850, he will go down in American history as the great compromiser. Okay? Now remember, wasn't he one of the original what? Famous 3, who's elderly now. He's aged, he's ill, he's weary, but even though he stood before the Senate to plead once again for reason and compromise, and his compromise that we will explain to you will go down in American history as the Compromise of 1850, and this is what he proposed. Number 1, admit California into the Union as a free state. This is what he proposed. This is what his compromise consisted of. Number 1, admit California into the Union as a free state. I'll guarantee you this will be on your test, so just so you know. Organize the land, number 2, organize the land that was acquired from Mexico into American territories based on the concept of popular sovereignty, which is on your ID sheet and which we briefly mentioned yesterday. So the second part of his compromise was to organize the land that was acquired from Mexico into American territories based on the concept of popular sovereignty. What is popular sovereignty again? Remember from yesterday?
Popular vote, whatever they vote.
On what issue here specifically? Yeah. So the people in the American territories that lived in those territories would decide what? If they were slave or free. So he's proposing that we'll organize all this land that we gained as a result of the war with Mexico into American territories, and then allow popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery. If a majority of the people in the territory want slavery, it'll be slave. If they want it to be free, it'll be free. It also called for the abolishing of buying and selling slaves in the District of Columbia. It abolished the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia.
Did you miss 3? Payment of $10 million to Texas?
No.
Oh, okay.
The abolishing of buying and selling slaves in the District of Columbia. Now, think about that a little bit. What were Southerners upset about prior? That the District of Columbia was considering what? Abolishing slavery. Does abolishing the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia abolish slavery there? No. So that was the compromise. Okay? It didn't mention or abolish slavery itself. So basically you could have slaves in the District of Columbia, but you couldn't buy or sell any slaves there. So it abolished the buying and selling slaves in the District of Columbia. It did not abolish slavery itself in the District of Columbia. And finally, it asked for an effective fugitive slave law, which means that states and local authorities would be required to capture runaway slaves and return those back to their owners. So, we're going to bring California into the Union as a slave state, or excuse me, as a free state. That should satisfy which group? The North. We're going to organize the land that was acquired from Mexico into American territories, and we're going to base that on the concept of popular sovereignty, where they get to make their choice. Although not both sides aren't going to be happy, because North isn't going to like slavery and South isn't going to like no slavery. At least you can choose. So that made them feel good about that. They're going to abolish the buying of selling slaves in the District of Columbia, but they're not going to abolish slavery itself as a compromise that the North and South aren't going to be thrilled about, but they're not going to be mad about because there was a compromise made. And the effective fugitive slave law that would require states and local authorities to capture and return runaway slaves back to their owners seems like it would upset the South still, right? Or excuse me, upset the North, but they are admitting California as a free state, so there's the trade-off there. Now, Texas seemed to think that New Mexico should be part of their state. And rightfully probably should have, considering the impact that Texas had on New Mexico. So to clear up that problem, the government gave $10 million to the state of Texas to abandon any of their claims they may have had in New Mexico. So if you lived in New Mexico, you could consider yourself possibly a Texan prior to this, but they're going to make it real clear that New Mexico is not going to be part of Texas, and in order to get Texas to agree to that, what they have to give them? $10 million. So they're trying to get all these things, all these problems solved. So let's look back at the problems again. The South is upset because California is going to come into the Union as a free state. What was the trade-off there? Now, what was the trade-off? The fugitive slave law. Okay? Both Southerners and Northerners were upset because of the issue of slavery remained unsettled. Well, they settled it by popular sovereignty. Southerners were upset that the North supported a law that would abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. They compromised. No more buying and selling, but there still were slaves in Washington, D.C. And Northerners were upset and opposed to the Southern request for a fugitive slave law, but what did they get in return? California. Okay? So there you go. That was the compromise. Well, Congress, the House and the Senate, debated this for 6 months. 6 months this was debated. That was a long time. And after talking it through, which was probably smart, finally in September of 1850, the House and the Senate adopted all of Henry Clay's compromises by large majorities. So there was no disagreement hardly. But the reason is probably because they debated this back and forth for 6 months, talked about it, hammered it out, agreed, maybe agreed to disagree. And finally in September of 1850, both houses of Congress, both the House and the Senate, voted to adopt Henry Clay's compromise. And the vote was done by large majorities. So another compromise, this time the Compromise of 1850, saves the day for the United States and keeps us out of a war. Yeah,
What year did they go with the study?
1850, that's the name, Compromise of 1850. Now, who would normally sign this compromise into law? The President. Unfortunately, President Taylor was not the person to sign this. He died in July of 1850 while in office. And his Vice President, Millard Fillmore, was the one that actually signed the Compromise of 1850 after he assumed the presidency. So President Zachary Taylor dies in July of 1850, and as a result, Vice President Millard Fillmore ascends to the presidency, and he is the man that will sign the compromise bill once he's president. Okay, that'll take us to another presidential election, the election of 1852. The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire as their candidate. The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce. Now, the Whigs, who had nominated a military hero in Zachary Taylor, bypassed Millard Fillmore, the vice president, and nominated another hero of the Mexican War, General Winfield Scott. He's the one that led the march, remember, through the halls of Montezuma and captured Mexico City in the Mexican War. Well, that's who the Whigs nominate. They're going to follow the same strategy. They're going to nominate someone that has absolutely no political experience again in General Winfield Scott. Well, Scott doesn't see the same success that Zachary Taylor did in the election of 1848, and Pierce wins 27 of the 31 states available to become President of the United States. No, just the two. So, this fellow right here, Franklin Pierce, this is Millard Fillmore, by the way. Franklin Pierce wins the election of 1852 and becomes President of the United States. Well, slavery is going to continue to be a problem. It's going to stymie his administration. And President Pierce doesn't do much during his 4 years in office and simply leaves quietly after the election of 1856. Serves 4 pretty inconsequential years in office. Not much of a president. Any ever heard of Franklin Pierce even to this point? All right, now this is going to take us to an interesting thing, and that's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What do we have over here, William? We got 2 territories right here, clear over here. Kansas and Nebraska. Okay? All of these other states have come into the Union, but now you got a pretty vast area over here. Kansas and Nebraska. Okay? Now, by this time, remember Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois? He had a vision of a transcontinental railroad westward from Chicago to the west. Okay, where's Chicago? And it's got to go right through this area here that we know as the Kansas-Nebraska Territory. And he's got this vision of a transcontinental railroad. Had to go from Chicago through what we know as the Kansas-Nebraska territory. Yep.
Wait,
He wants it to go from Chicago westward through that area of land to the west. This would be Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. We'll hear more about him later. Well, what he wants to do is he wants to create this territory right here into two separate territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He also wanted to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Why would he want to do that? Why would he want to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820?
So we could have slave work on the railroad.
Well, he wouldn't get into a controversy over slavery. That's exactly right. Now, remember, what did the Missouri Compromise of 1820 state? That all lands north of 36 have to be free. Okay? So what he does is he goes to Congress and he asks them for three things. First of all, he wants them to pay for this railroad line that he's wishing to build. He wants them to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And he wants to create this land west of the Mississippi River into two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. So in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas has vision of a transcontinental railroad west from Chicago. In order to achieve this goal, he's going to have to sponsor a bill through Congress that would ask the federal government to pay for the construction of the rail line, would ask Congress to repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820 because of the issue of slavery, and he would want to create this land west of the Mississippi into two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Congress passed that bill, and it became known in history as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, let's take the third part of that. What do you do in the third part of that bill? What do you do? What Congress do? What? They opened a great big new amount of land that will become an American territory. And so what did people do whose lives maybe weren't so good east of the Mississippi? They began to move. So soon after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, many pioneers and land speculators, those that buy land at one price and sell it for more later, they rush into the new territories. And where do they come from? Both the this and the that. They come from both the north and the south. So they're going to have their own philosophies on what? Slavery. Okay? So soon after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, eager pioneers and land speculators from both the north and the south are rushing into these new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Now they're competing for the best land, the most promising sites for new towns, etc. But once again, the issue of slavery is going to rise. Now, what was Stephen Douglas's philosophy of slavery in those two new territories? Don't think about what he proposed in the lands acquired from Mexico. What did he say? States choose popular sovereignty. So the new territories of Kansas by virtue of this passage of this bill, would be free to decide on the issue of slavery themselves. Once everybody got over there, or maybe not even once they got there, as soon as enough people got over there, what were they going to do? Vote. Is this territory going to be slave or free? Well, we'll talk about that. Well, once again, the issue of slavery is going to rise to violence. Each of those two territories is going to try to draw up territorial constitutions. They're going to try to organize a territorial government, because you have to do those two things before you can vote. So people are rushing into both of those areas, looking for the best land, the best town sites, hurrying up, trying to draw up a territorial constitution, trying to organize a territorial government. And the controversy would be in the Kansas territory. Now in Kansas, there were too many split feelings between slavery and non-slavery, and because of that, when they were trying to put up their constitutions, one group ended up with a constitution where slavery was legal, and another group came up with a constitution in which slavery was prohibited. That's how the population went into that particular territory. And as a result of that difference of opinion, what happened? What occurred? Fights. We call it violence, which leads to our next subtopic, which is bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas. I'm trying to find something. Oh, there it is. Bleeding Kansas.